Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
The first thing Aunt Caroline said to me wasn't, "Hello," or even, "I'm sorry for your loss." It was, "You can't sit at the front." She didn't lower her voice, didn't wait until we were alone, didn't soften it with a sympathetic look or even pretend to be civil. She said it right there at the church entrance, in front of a handful of his old army buddies, some neighbors I hadn't seen in decades, and a distant cousin who looked at me like I was tracking mud through a sacred space. "You weren't that important to him," she added, her eyes narrowing with that thin, sour judgment she'd been carrying since I was 17. She always looked like she'd just tasted something bitter, and for some reason, it was always me. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I was tired. Tired of proving I belonged. Tired of carrying the weight of a story no one else wanted to hear. I hadn't even been back in this town for a full 24 hours, and already the air felt heavy with the same tension I'd left behind when I first drove out all those years ago, swearing never to return. But here I was, dressed in plain black slacks and a long coat, hair tied back, standing alone outside a church that smelled like mildew and old grief, being told I didn't matter. I walked past her without another word and took a seat near the back, far enough that no one would mistake me for part of the grieving inner circle. The people in the front pews wore their sadness like a uniform, rehearsed and expected, tight lips, dabbed eyes, slow nods to the preacher's words. I sat quietly, keeping my hands folded in my lap while my father's casket stood silent at the altar, closed and polished, surrounded by a ring of lilies and cheap plastic wreaths with ribboned condolences written in gold. I kept waiting to feel something more than dull anger. Maybe regret. Maybe sadness. But all I felt was a slow-burning shame, not for myself, but for the absurd performance this whole thing had become. You want to know something strange? I didn't cry. Not when I heard he passed. Not when I saw the obituary online that listed me as survived by one estranged daughter. Not when I pulled up outside the house I grew up in and saw the rusted mailbox still leaning to one side. I didn't cry because tears require permission. And for people like me, those written out of family narratives, boxed up in the attic with the other messy stories, it's hard to find a place where crying doesn't feel like trespassing. But I did feel something when I reached into my coat pocket and touched the envelope he sent me 2 days before he died. It was postmarked from a hospice center I hadn't even known he was in, with a shaky, slanted handwriting I barely recognized. "For Sam" was all it said on the outside. I didn't open it right away. I had driven 12 hours straight from Chicago, telling myself I was just going out of respect, not sentiment. But that envelope, it felt heavier than paper somehow. Like it carried more than words. I waited until I was alone in my motel room, the kind with a flickering lamp and a TV bolted to the dresser, before I finally peeled it open. Inside was a folded sheet of yellow paper with just 4 lines scrawled in a familiar, broken print. "I know I failed. I never wanted you to think you didn't matter. Look in locker 18. Storage on Mill and Curtis. Combinations the same as your old badge number. I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. But it was something." He remembered my badge number. He knew I'd kept it. After all the shouting, the years of silence, after the night I packed up my things and left while he pretended not to notice from the other room, he remembered the number. He was watching. Somehow, he was still watching. So I sat there at the funeral, looking straight ahead while Pastor Lowell read from Psalms, and Aunt Caroline dabbled her eyes like a widow even though she was just the sister. People nodded along like this was some big noble farewell, like my father was nothing more than the caricature they built over the years, gruff, detached, maybe a little difficult, but fundamentally a good man. And maybe he was. But not in the way they told it. Not in the version where I didn't matter. At some point during the sermon, I felt someone watching me. I turned slightly and saw Mitch Carter, one of Dad's drinking buddies from the Legion Hall, sitting 2 rows up. He gave me a nod. Just one. But it wasn't pity. It was recognition. Like he knew I wasn't there for show. Like he knew what that envelope might have said. That's when it hit me. If my father had something to hide or something to say, it wasn't going to be found in these eulogies or the stories people told over casserole at the reception. It would be found in that locker. 18. on Mill and Curtis. The place where he used to rent a unit for his spare parts and tools. A place I hadn't thought about in over 15 years. So here's my question for you. Just think about this for a second. If someone tells you you weren't important to the dead, but then the dead go out of their way, in their final days, to leave only you a key, do you listen to the living, or to the silence they tried to speak through? The service ended the way they all do. Songs, handshakes, hugs, half-hearted invitations to keep in touch. I kept my mouth shut. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't push back on the insult of being told I didn't belong. I just waited. Because some forms of revenge don't come with shouting matches or punches thrown. Sometimes revenge is quiet, patient, waiting for its cue. And mine? Mine started with a locker key and a bad feeling that my father's story wasn't the one everyone else was telling. By the time the hearse pulled away, I was already gone. I left the church before the final hymn finished echoing against the stained glass windows, slipping out the side like someone who wasn't invited in the first place, because after that encounter at the entrance and the eyes that followed me like I was a thief among mourners, I had no intention of pretending I belonged in that scene, where grief was worn like a corsage and memory was rewritten to fit a script no one had the guts to question. The wind outside carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and old oil from the garage next door. My father would have liked that, the mix of mechanical and natural, the smell of the two things he trusted most, machines and seasons, because unlike people, they didn't lie. I drove across town without turning the radio on, the silence in the car almost too loud, except for the constant scraping of the worn-out wiper blade that never quite stopped squeaking even though the sky was bone dry. It was a familiar sound, oddly comforting, like all the years I'd spent patrolling late-night highways in Illinois, alone in a cruiser, with nothing but my own thoughts and static dispatch to keep me company. But this was different. This wasn't about running down suspects or pulling drunks off the road. This was about answers, and not just the ones I hoped to find in that damn storage locker, but answers to questions I hadn't let myself ask in over 2 decades. The storage facility on Mill and Curtis hadn't changed much since I'd last seen it. The gravel lot was still half-patched, the chain-link fence sagged near the corner, and the paint on the sign was so faded you could barely make out the name anymore. I pulled into a spot facing the row of metal doors, each one the same dull gray with rust-streaked handles and a dent or two from years of careless renters. Unit 18 sat near the end, under a crooked security light that buzzed like it was on its last breath. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on gravel, and stood for a long moment with the combination lock in my hand, staring at the numbers like they might unlock something more than steel. The code was easy. It was the number burned into my brain since the day I was sworn in, my first badge number. The same one my father had looked at that night, the last time we really spoke, when I told him I was leaving town for good to take the job, and he stood in the doorway with a beer in his hand, saying nothing, just nodding once like it hurt too much to say more. I'd mistaken his silence for disapproval. I thought he saw me as a disappointment, someone who didn't fit into his world of tools and grit and quiet masculinity. But the fact that he remembered that number, down to the last digit, and trusted I'd remember it too, told a different story. One I wasn't ready for. When the lock clicked open and the door creaked upward, I didn't expect to find much. Maybe some old tools, a box or two of forgotten junk, maybe a few photo albums he couldn't bring himself to throw away. But what I saw made me stop cold. Inside, neatly stacked along the back wall, were 3 boxes marked Blake Family. They were duct-taped and labeled in his handwriting, the kind that always slanted to the left like he couldn't be bothered to slow down. But there, on top of everything else, sitting alone on an overturned bucket, was a sealed manila envelope with my name written across it in thick black marker for Sam. Not Samantha, not Kiddo, not the nickname he used when he was in a good mood. Just Sam. Direct. No frills. Like the truth, when it finally lands. I tore it open with more urgency than I expected, like part of me had been waiting for this moment my entire life, and inside I found more than I'd ever imagined. There was a letter, typed, not handwritten, 6 pages long, single-spaced, as if he'd sat down and poured everything out in one sitting, probably from a hospice bed with the oxygen machine humming beside him and the weight of death finally forcing him to speak. The first 2 pages were about him. Not excuses, not justifications, just facts, raw and unpolished, like the confession of a man who knew he didn't have much time left and no reason to keep hiding. He wrote about Vietnam, about coming home to a country that didn't want him, and a brother who used his absence to build a business on lies and stolen money. He wrote about how he tried to protect his younger sister, Caroline, but she married into that same filth and never looked back. He wrote about how, when Mom left, he couldn't cope, didn't know how to raise a daughter on his own, so he did what most damaged men do. He closed up, built walls, and drank more than he should have. But then came the part that punched the breath right out of me. He wrote, "You were the best thing I ever had, Sam, and I didn't know how to hold on to that without ruining it. So I let go too soon. I thought pushing you away would give you a cleaner start. I thought if I acted like you weren't important, it'd hurt less when I wasn't around anymore. But I was wrong." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to fix it with platitudes. He simply acknowledged it, his absence, his mistakes, the damage, and for once in his life, he left the door open for me to walk through. At the end of the letter, stapled to the final page, was a photo. I recognized it instantly. Me, age 13, standing next to him in his old garage, grease on my jeans and a spark plug in my hand, grinning like I'd just discovered fire. He'd kept it. All these years. He'd carried it with him, even when we weren't speaking, even when Aunt Caroline was telling anyone who would listen that I was nothing more than a selfish cop who ran away. I leaned against the cold wall of the locker, feeling the sharp edge of something I hadn't let in for years, grief, maybe, or guilt, or some tangled hybrid of the two, and read the last line of his letter again and again until I could hear his voice in it. "Find Mitch Carter. He'll tell you what I couldn't. Then do what you need to do." I folded the letter slowly, slipped it back into the envelope, and stood there in that narrow locker with the late afternoon sun bleeding through the cracks in the door, realizing that everything I thought I knew about my father's silence had been a lie I told myself to stay angry. And if Mitch Carter held the final piece, I wasn't going to waste another minute pretending I didn't care. I locked the unit, slid the envelope into my coat, and drove toward the edge of town, already dialing a number I hadn't called since high school, already preparing for the next chapter in a story I was just beginning to understand. The further I drove away from the storage unit, the heavier the envelope in my coat pocket seemed to become, as if the paper and ink inside had absorbed decades of silences, misunderstandings, mischances, and words unsaid until it carried the weight of a casket itself, a private kind of grief that wasn't loud or visible, but settled into the bones like a cold front you couldn't outrun. I didn't head straight to Mitch Carter's place, though I already knew where he lived. Hadn't forgotten the red-painted porch steps that chipped every winter, or the wind chimes that used to hang crooked from the rafters and jingle in the background of his drunken stories about my father and their reckless youth. Instead, I checked into a cheap motor lodge off Route 12, the kind with flickering hallway lights and faded floral bedspreads, because I needed space to think, to sit with what I had just read. And to go through those boxes I didn't have time to touch when I opened the locker. The room smelled like old smoke and disinfectant, a combination I'd come to associate with transient lives and stories that didn't quite finish themselves. I set the envelope on the nightstand, removed my coat, and dragged the first box from the floor onto the bed. It was heavier than it looked, and when I tore off the duct tape and peeled back the flaps, the scent of aged paper and faint motor oil hit me square in the face. This was my father's world in cardboard form. Pieces of a life never meant to be curated for display, but instead preserved through inertia, through the refusal to throw anything away, just in case it mattered someday. Inside the first box were faded photographs, most of them black and white or bleached out by time, showing the early years him in uniform, arms slung around men whose names I didn't recognize, but whose eyes looked like his, tired and watchful. Standing in jungles and on tarmacs and in front of rusted jeeps with cigarette smoke curling into the air above them like ghosts that hadn't quite moved on. There were also letters, dozens of them, bundled in rubber bands, some from my mother, written in elegant cursive I hadn't seen since she left us when I was a kid, others from people whose names meant nothing to me but who clearly once meant something to him. One stack was marked Caroline, and though I told myself I didn't care what she had to say, I couldn't help but open one and skim it, only to find cold, clipped demands about money, property, and obligations. Her handwriting as rigid as her posture at the funeral, with none of the softness you'd expect from a sister writing to a brother. Slowly falling apart. The second box was mechanical, blueprints for engines, hand-sketched diagrams, receipts from 100 small repairs done in cash for neighbors and friends who couldn't afford dealership prices. This was the part of him people understood, the part that made sense to them. He fixed things. He worked with his hands. He didn't talk much. But it was the third box that changed everything. This one wasn't labeled like the others. The tape was fresher, as if he'd packed it more recently, maybe even in those final weeks at the hospice when the end became real. Inside was a small wooden cigar box, which I recognized from his old workbench, though I'd never seen what he kept inside. I opened it slowly, half expecting it to be empty, and instead found a police badge, tarnished, old, clearly not his. I turned it over in my hand, confused, until I saw the name etched on the back, Carter, M. My chest tightened. Mitch Carter. The man I was planning to see. My father had kept his badge, hidden it, preserved it like some relic of a friendship or maybe a secret, and suddenly the instruction in the letter, find Mitch Carter. He'll tell you what I couldn't. Took on a sharper edge. It wasn't just about stories or closure. It was about something left unfinished, something my father couldn't or wouldn't explain outright, either because he didn't trust himself to say it or because he wanted me to discover it for myself, piece by piece. Beneath the badge was a small folded note, written in that same shaky script from the envelope. It said only, you'll understand why I never talked. Just listen to him. Then decide what to do. It didn't feel like a request. It felt like a passing of the torch, or maybe a confession by proxy, the kind of thing people do when they know they can't carry the burden themselves any longer. I sat on the edge of the bed, badge in one hand, note in the other, and stared at the peeling wallpaper like it might offer answers. What connection could a small-town mechanic and a disgraced ex-cop possibly have that needed to be hidden away in a locked unit, protected by a badge number only I would remember? And what was I supposed to do with that knowledge once it came to light? I didn't come back to this town to stir up old mud. I came to say goodbye, maybe to find peace, but certainly not to unearth a mess that had been buried with my father's silence. Still, the seed had already been planted, and like anything that starts growing inside your chest, it wouldn't let me rest. I placed the cigar box back into the cardboard one, packed everything up again with care, and sat at the edge of the bed for a long time, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling. There was a knock at the wall from the neighboring room, someone yelling at someone else, an argument muffled by cheap insulation, but I didn't move. I was already elsewhere. Back in my father's garage. Back in the smell of oil and ash and lost years. Back in the moment I realized he hadn't given me answers, he'd given me a trail. And now it was mine to follow. In the morning, I would find Mitch Carter. And whatever he had to say, I would listen. Because if my father had trusted him with his truth, then I needed to know what it cost them both to keep it buried for so long. By the time the morning sun began to leak through the yellowed curtains of my motel room, slicing the dim air into streaks of uncertain light, I had gone through every page of my father's letter again, reread the one-sentence note beneath Mitch Carter's old badge, and sat for hours in the kind of silence that doesn't offer peace, only momentum. There's a point where stillness becomes louder than anything else, louder than confrontation, louder than mourning, louder even than regret, and by the time I walked out of that room, the only thing I knew with complete certainty was that I could no longer trust the narrative that had been handed to me. Neither the one told by Aunt Caroline in her venom-dipped remarks, nor the one I'd constructed for myself to justify leaving everything behind. Mitch still lived in the same house off Old Sawyer Road, the one with the leaning mailbox duct-taped at the hinge and the rusted swing set in the front yard that hadn't held a child in decades. The driveway was cluttered with half-dead trucks and a boat that hadn't touched water in at least 10 years, and the siding of the house peeled like sunburnt skin, giving the whole place a kind of forgotten dignity, as if it had once tried to matter but had given up somewhere along the way. I parked near the edge of the yard, stepped out into the humid air that carried the familiar weight of July in this town, and stood for a moment with my hand on the envelope in my coat pocket, my father's letter folded tightly inside. As if it were some sort of amulet I needed to hold on to in order to keep moving forward. I didn't knock right away. I stood there on the porch, taking in the faint sounds of a radio playing classic rock from inside, a lawnmower somewhere in the distance, and the occasional creak of the porch boards beneath my boots. When I finally knocked, it wasn't Mitch who answered but a woman in her 50s, hair pulled back tight, eyes suspicious in that familiar small-town way that said everything new was a potential threat until proven otherwise. "He's in the back," she said, before I could even speak. "Working on the generator. Don't mind the dog, she just barks, never bites." She gave me a nod that carried neither warmth nor rudeness, just acknowledgement, like she already knew why I was here and didn't care enough to interfere. I followed the path around the side of the house, gravel crunching underfoot, the air growing thicker with the scent of gasoline and sweat, until I found Mitch hunched over a piece of machinery, cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth, hands covered in grease, face sun-leathered and weathered like a worn-out boot. He looked up when he heard me, squinting against the light, and for a moment his expression was unreadable, neither surprised nor pleased, just still. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet, wiped his hands on an old rag, and took the cigarette from his mouth. "Well, damn," he muttered, not quite a greeting. "Sam Blake. Thought I might see you eventually." I didn't respond right away. I pulled the badge from my coat pocket, held it out in my palm without a word, and watched as his eyes dropped to it, the weight of memory hitting him like a gut punch. He didn't take it, just stared at it for a long moment before looking back up at me, and in that second, something shifted. The posturing, the guardedness, the small-town suspicion, it all fell away. "He kept it," Mitch said quietly, almost to himself. "After all these years." "He left it for me," I replied. "Along with a letter. Said you'd tell me what he couldn't." Mitch didn't say anything for a long while. He turned, gestured toward a couple of old folding chairs under the porch awning, and without waiting to see if I followed, walked over and sat down with the kind of slowness that comes from years of physical pain and emotional weight. I joined him, settling into the chair across from him, and for a while we just sat there, watching the dust hang in the air like suspended time. "Your dad," he began finally, exhaling smoke, "was a good man in all the ways that didn't always show. Not a saint, not even close, but loyal like few people ever are. And loyal men," he paused, his voice catching for just a second, "they make enemies when they refuse to bend." He told me everything. Not in dramatic bursts, but with the exhausted rhythm of someone who had carried a truth too long and no longer had the strength to shape it for drama or denial. He and my father had been involved in a quiet investigation, unofficial and buried, into my uncle, Caroline's husband, who had been laundering money through local construction bids, drugging inventory reports, and funneling untraceable cash into consulting companies that didn't exist. My father, who had been working part-time for the city's fleet maintenance department, stumbled on falsified repair invoices, payments to vendors who had no physical location, and eventually, a warehouse that held not parts, but stolen property tagged for auction. When he brought it to Mitch, who had been a police officer back then, they started collecting evidence together, quietly, carefully, because they knew how deep the roots went and how quickly someone would bury them if they made a noise. But when Mitch got too close, when he filed a report that disappeared the next day and found his locker broken into, the retaliation came swiftly and without ceremony, forced resignation. Accusations of misconduct that were never proven but were believed just enough to ruin him. My father, for his part, didn't speak a word. He stayed in the background, took the heat, let his family think he was just grumpy and detached, let Caroline spin the narrative that he was a bitter, broken man who couldn't accept how her husband had made something of himself. He watched his daughter walk away from it all, walk away from him, and still said nothing, because if he spoke, the blowback would have destroyed more than reputations. It would have reached me. And that, Mitch said, was the one thing David Blake couldn't allow. He didn't want you near it, Mitch told me, voice low and shaking, so he let you hate him. Thought that'd be safer. I sat there, the badge still in my hand, heart pounding in that deep, echoing way that comes when the floor under your memories begins to crack. Every bitter word I'd ever thought about him, every angry assumption, every cold silence, it all came rushing back, now reframed by the knowledge that my father had sacrificed his own name to keep mine clean. Not by abandoning me, but by building a wall so thick and silent I'd never see over it. He was trying to protect me, I said, more to myself than to Mitch. Yeah, he said, lighting another cigarette, hands trembling slightly. But he never figured out how to protect you without losing you in the process. As the sun dipped behind the trees and the sky turned that quiet shade of pink that always seems to linger in small towns just a little longer than it should, I stood up, walked to the edge of the porch, and stared out at the crooked fence line and overgrown weeds like they might offer some form of resolution. But none came. Not yet. Because now I knew. And knowing meant deciding. And I wasn't sure if I was the kind of person who could let a truth like that stay buried. Especially not with the funeral reception still coming. Especially not with Aunt Caroline standing up front, smiling like she owned the right to rewrite the ending. The morning of the funeral reception arrived with a kind of thick, oppressive heat that made every movement feel heavy and deliberate, as if the air itself was unwilling to let go of the past, as if the weather had conspired to slow time just enough for every moment to linger with added weight and meaning. I had spent the night lying fully dressed on top of the motel bedspread, staring at the ceiling fan spinning endlessly overhead, not because I expected sleep to come, but because I needed stillness to collect the fury gathering in the corners of my chest. A fury that had taken its time becoming fully formed, born not of rage but of bitter clarity, the kind that doesn't scream or lash out, but tightens its grip and waits for the right moment to let go, not for destruction, but for justice wrapped in silence. I had made my decision in the early hours before dawn, sometime between the third reading of my father's letter and the slow unraveling of every lie that had ever been told in that house with the sagging porch and the too-clean living room where Caroline now hosted mourners like she was auditioning for sainthood. I wasn't going to interrupt the eulogy or throw accusations into a crowd of half-listening neighbors and second cousins who came more for the finger sandwiches and iced tea than for any real sense of loyalty to the man lying cold in the casket. That kind of performance wasn't what my father deserved, and it wasn't what I wanted. No, what I wanted was silence, the kind that unsettles a room more than shouting ever could, the kind of silence that follows an undeniable truth being laid bare in front of those who built their identities on secrets they thought would never see daylight. I wore my uniform. It wasn't a statement meant to provoke. It was a declaration of presence, a reminder that while they had tried to erase me from his life's final chapter, I had not only returned, but arrived standing tall, not as some lost daughter desperate for validation, but as the one person who had carried his truth forward when everyone else chose comfort over courage. I walked into the church again, this time through the front doors, past the rows of polished shoes and tight-lipped smiles, past the looks of confusion that bloomed into whispers almost immediately, and past Aunt Caroline, who turned toward me with the practiced expression of someone about to deliver a measured insult, only to find her words catching in her throat as her eyes traced the lines of the uniform she couldn't ignore. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The room, by then, had already begun to shift. Eyes followed me not out of judgment, but out of curiosity tinged with something deeper, recognition, perhaps, or unease. I didn't stop to explain. I didn't meet their stares with smiles or apologies. I walked down the center aisle with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where she belonged, and when I reached the casket, I turned to face the congregation, still silent, still letting the weight of the moment settle like dust on old furniture. Pastor Lowell, standing nearby with a sermon tucked between trembling fingers, gave me a questioning look, his eyes filled not with suspicion but with cautious concern. as if he sensed something larger unfolding and wasn't sure if he was meant to intervene or bear witness. I gave him a small nod, not of request, but of assurance. I would not disrupt his ceremony. I would only reshape its meaning. I stepped forward, opened the envelope I had carried from the motel, and removed 2 items. The first was the letter, my father's final message, folded cleanly and placed in the inside pocket of his coat when I gently reached into the open casket without ceremony, without spectacle, only care. The second was Mitch Carter's badge, the tarnished, scratched token of a man who had been discarded by the very institution he once served, whose silence had preserved my father's reputation even as his own had been torn apart by lies none of the people in this room had ever questioned. I placed the badge next to the folded letter, right on the fabric of my father's lapel, making sure it was seen, making sure it would be part of whatever story was told after today. Then I stepped back, turned toward the pews, and spoke, not loudly, not angrily, but clearly, with the kind of even tone I'd learned during years of depositions and death notifications, when emotion had to be held in check in order for truth to survive the weight of its own telling. You told me I wasn't important to him, I said, locking eyes with Caroline, who stared back at me as if she couldn't quite recognize the person standing in front of her. You said I didn't belong at the front, that I didn't matter. But he remembered my badge number. Not yours. He remembered mine. In the end, he trusted me to carry what you couldn't. There were no gasps, no dramatic reactions, just silence, thick and absolute, the kind that settles in a room when the air is too full of reality to carry sound. I didn't wait for permission to sit. I turned, took a seat in the front row, folded my hands, and looked straight ahead as Pastor Lowell slowly stepped forward and resumed the eulogy, his voice quivering slightly now, unsure of what had just shifted but knowing, intuitively, that something had. After the service, people didn't crowd around me. Some gave respectful nods, others avoided my gaze entirely, as if proximity to me might expose them to a truth they weren't ready to see. Caroline didn't approach. She remained rooted in place, her expression frozen somewhere between contempt and confusion, her world, so carefully constructed out of half-truths and well-timed silences, beginning to show cracks around the edges. And I said nothing more, because nothing more needed to be said. The badge spoke louder than I ever could. When I walked back to my car, the wind had picked up slightly, rustling the trees and sending loose petals from the floral arrangements drifting across the parking lot like confetti for a parade no one had planned. I got in, started the engine, and sat there for a long moment with my hands on the wheel, not ready to leave, not ready to stay, but deeply aware that something had closed, and something else, something quieter but more permanent, had begun. Some people believe revenge is loud, that it's about confrontation or exposure or dragging skeletons out of closets and into the center of the room for everyone to gawk at. But my revenge wasn't built on spectacle. It didn't need shouts or slaps or scandal. My revenge came in the form of stillness, in the moment I walked through the door in full uniform and took the place that was mine by right, not by invitation, and reclaimed the story they tried to erase me from. He was my father. He didn't always show love the way people expect it, and he damn sure made mistakes, but in the end, he left his truth with me, not with them. And I made sure they saw it. Not for approval, not for praise, but so they would never again speak about who was important to him without first looking into the silence he left behind and finding my voice already waiting there.